Hi and welcome back. I'm Ricardo, aka the Mad Hatter, and this is a series about color theory. Specifically, we are talking about principles and concepts of color theory to apply them to the creative use of light and color. If you're new to the channel, I would highly recommend you check the previous videos in the series. In the last one, we dwelled the concept of light justification, or in other words, how light works and how by understanding it, we can manipulate it to make it feel organic and natural in our scene. Today, we're exploring another key concept, exposure. We're gonna first understand what that is, and later, how we can use that creatively. Buckle up now, as the first part of the video will have to be technical, but I promise you, it will be worth it. Similar to what we did in the last video, we're gonna simplify everything that we can to make the concepts easier to understand. In this case, we're going to make the assumption that light is monochromatic, so we're going to completely discard color. What is exposure? Before I give you the technical definition, pause the video and try to type in the comment what you think exposure is. While we often believe we understand a concept, being able to articulate it in words is the best practice to really own it. In the simplest of terms, exposure is the amount of light present in a scene. This concept applied to photography means that the exposure is the amount of light that reaches the film or the sensor. Commonly, we measure exposure in stops unit. It is important to notice that a stop is a relative unit of measure, as it is defined as a doubling or halving of the amount of light. This is a crucial concept to understand, as it tells us that the exposure, by its definition, is a relative concept. So why do we so often hear about over and underexposure? These two concepts are often linked to a third one, which you might have already heard of, middle grey. Given any lightness scale, middle grey is the tone that perceptually sits halfway between total black and total white. One fascinating fact is that through evolution, our eye developed the ability to adjust to light changes so that skin tone pretty much always falls in that tonal range. Thus, as our species developed photography, exposure was coded around the concept of middle grey, as that produced images that would feel natural and pleasing. With this concept established, over and underexposure simply refers to scenes where the majority of it is either brighter or darker than middle grey. As we unravel these concepts, I hope that it is slowly becoming clear to you that the common assumption that over and underexposure are technical errors is actually a limitation to your creativity. Let's now look at a few scenes from famous movies to see this concept in practice. Here we are in DaVinci. As you can see, I've already taken in a few stills from 3 famous movies. Well, actually, one is a series. We have Seven, Dune, and Euphoria Season 2. I've already done some prep to the timeline, so as we said at the beginning, let's discuss color. Let's put this in black and white. Let's also introduce a new tool, which is Lachman zones. If you don't know, Lachman is a great cinematographer. I would highly recommend you check out his works. You already know it, I promise. But what he did was, when there was a transition between digital and film, he wanted to be able to still talk about stops when talking about exposure on digital instead of EVs. So he developed this system which codes everything, and depending on the color space you're on, it adapts to create this false color scheme that is based on stops rather than simply EVs. As you can see, there's 0, which is middle grey. This is always set to middle grey. It of course shifts depending on the color space you're on, but it's always set to middle grey. And everything else you see around just is scaled up. And you can see we have a very nice chart at the bottom of it that has a first increase of half a stop around middle grey and then goes down by a stop up until 6 stops over and under. Now, let's deactivate this for a second and let's also look at the scopes. In the scopes, I've also done something for you, which is I've created a line that you can see here, this wide line here. This is set at middle grey for Rec. 709 2.4, which is the color space we are in right now. Again, we're gonna look at over and underexposed scenes, so scenes that live mostly below or over this line. Now, let's start with 7, shall we? The cinematographer, Khondji, is well known for his use of exposure, and that's why I picked him. And in this specific case, we're looking at the interior shots in 7. Let's pick, for example, this one, which is a great example of what I want to talk about. What Khondji did in this movie is he exposed for the exteriors when shooting interiors. Effectively, this made sure that the interiors were always feeling dark, moody, and mysterious. 7, it's all about mystery. It's about finding out what we don't know. How does this translate in Khondji's cinematography? Well, he makes sure that we don't really see what's going on. The other cool thing about exposing like this is that if we go to this shot here, we do get detail in the light beams. In fact, if I pick again the Lachman zones, you can see that the exposure is actually on the outer rim of the beams of light. And most of the beam of light then is correctly exposed. Everything else you can see is pretty dark. It never goes crazy, so the majority of it is staying 2 stops below middle gray, which still allows us to have a good perception of what's going on. If I turn this off, we can still see details, right? Except for specific areas, which is important. You still want to be able to see detail, you just have to work to get them. Let's look at a few more shots. Here we are in a library. Again, he's searching for something, so the something is pretty dark, so you can't really find it, right? Again, Khondji is using exposure to serve the storytelling. Let's look at another shot of the interiors, and let's pull the Lachman zones up. You can see everything is pretty underexposed. The subjects, again, are in the range of the -2 stops. Okay, we get to -3, even -4 sometimes, but the areas that really go -5 and -6 are really areas where basically they don't want us to look. As a matter of fact, we really focus on where the light is pointing. And by the way, I have to say, in black and white, this really looks noir. It's fantastic. Let's now look at Dune. Dune is pretty interesting to me because it does both under and overexposure, which is really peculiar. And again, it serves the storytelling. We can see that we have a few shots that are, well, underexposed, okay, overexposed. But again, we have both. Well, this is a silhouette, so it's more common, but let's look at this one specifically. So, cinematographer here, Fraser, what's going on here? We are on an exterior and we are on this desert planet, super hot. Everything that is exterior is overexposed. All the concrete here, or whatever the material is overexposed. You can see it here, okay, in the scope, and you can see it here if I activate Lachman zones. But there's also a lot of the image which is underexposed. You can see literally there's nothing that is exposed. Why is this going on? So our protagonist here is passing in front of this wall, and inside there are the servants. And the idea is that these servants, he wants to look at them, but he can't. His eyes are used to the bright exterior, and so everything in here is too dark for him to see. And that's what we're getting here with the cinematography. You're given the perception that you can't see inside, and that's what they're going for, okay? That's the beauty of this shot, that's why I chose it, because it masterfully uses under and overexposure to tell what's going on. Let's now look at this scene here. This is a night scene, and they're being attacked. I don't want to make heavy spoilers, but basically they're getting attacked and they don't know who's attacking them. How do we convey that? We make everything pretty dark, so we don't really see what's going on. We see that there's armed people coming towards us, but we don't know who they are. We can't see their faces. That's pretty similar to what's going on here. In this case, again, these are mysterious figures. They don't really want us to know who they are, and so they are underexposed. There's some areas that are kinda correctly exposed, like this beam of lights. That's where the exposure sits there, and everything else is underexposed. But again, notice how we can still see all the details. There's never something where it's crushed, we lose details. Opposite scenario, exterior, this again is a desert planet, and they want to convey the fact that this is super hot, okay? It's super bright sunlight. How do you do that? You're overexposed. Similar thing here. In this case, it's even more purged as we almost lose detail here. And that's also an interesting subject to talk about. While you're underexposed, you should always try to keep details. When you're overexposed, you can get away with stuff being a bit blown or flattened. And this is because our eye naturally evolved to be able to see better in low light. Our eye is very good at seeing details in low light, not so really when we're looking at something very bright. Let's now finally go to Euphoria. A few things I want to talk about here. Euphoria is peculiar because it uses a reverser stock. Reverser stock, they have a very stark contrast and tend to clip at the top compared to what most films do, where they have a soft roll-off. Reverser tends to clip, and that's what we can see here, for example. And the beautiful thing here is that they wanted to portray a Californian hot day. How did they do it? They overexpose pretty much everything. You can see some of the details in the car, okay? All the shadow parts, you can see the details, but majority of the image, as you can see here, is overexposed, okay? And gives us that sense of very bright sunny day. Let's go to a couple more shots. In here, basically, there's a police bust, and you can see what's going on is the interior is pretty underexposed, the exterior is overexposed, and the idea here is, again, we don't really understand what's going on, right? Police busting in, they want to convey a confusing situation for the character inside. You have this incredible amount of sunlight coming in straight towards you. Your eye will take some time to adjust, and that's what they did here. A common mistake probably for beginner cinematographer or colorist would be, okay, let's try to, neutralize the exposure here. So, we get sort of like still, a bit darker inside, a bit brighter outside, but it's more compressed. In this case, we have a range that goes basically between -2 and +3, even 4 stops. So we have a range of effectively 5 to 6 stops, which is quite a lot. And that's the beauty of this shot, the dynamic range that we see. And the last thing that I want to look at is this shot. In this case, we have a flare. It's not that noticeable without color, so I'll just, for this one, bring back color. And you can see here, this is a flare, okay? Let's go back to black and white for a second. With flares, what will happen most of the time is that you'll get overexposure. And again, a beginner error as a colorist would be to try and still get these shadows pretty low, okay? To get a lot of contrast, to get sort of like a balanced contrast. The point is, most of these scenes, they're gonna evolve, okay? And this photo is gonna go away, and as it does so, this is gonna go crushed. As a colorist, as a cinematographer, as anyone that is using light and color creatively, think about your day-to-day experience when you light a scene, when you work on a scene. Does this feel natural? And again, there are exceptions to this. If you want to make something that looks unnatural, supernatural, of course, but still it needs to feel believable. And when you have a flare, when you're outside and you have a flare, your eyes needs a second to adjust. It won't like instantly go down, so everything else looks normal. So it's cool if in this case, the blacks lift. And if we take the Lachman zone, please notice something, that she is overexposed, but not by much. Majority of it is just half a stop overexposed to 2 stops, okay? So that's not a great range of overexposure. The sky gets pretty high. The shadows are still, correctly exposed, which is cool. But this is really important to notice. Well, mates, today we deep dived the concept of exposure and how properly understanding its meaning can serve our creative intent and storytelling. But exposure is just half of the equation when it comes to lighting a scene. As a matter of fact, being a relative concept, it is almost useless on its own unless we introduce its counterpart, contrast. This is what we're going to discuss in the next video. So in the meantime, let me know in the comments, is there any particular film that caught your eye for its use of exposure? Thank you for watching. I'll see you soon.